90 armed militants, 6 operators, one fortress crumbling from the inside. They had 20 minutes before the trucks closed in from every valley. 20 minutes to fortify walls that hadn't held a battle in 3 centuries. 20 minutes to decide who would live and who would be left behind in the snow. The enemy believed numbers made them invincible. They had never met Lena Mercer. She climbed to the highest overlook alone, set her rifle across broken stone, and began doing the one thing everyone in that mountain had quietly stopped believing was still possible: buying time. One trigger pull at a time. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Like, subscribe, and stay until the end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The mission was supposed to end quietly. That was the word Colonel Drayden used during the pre-op briefing at Forward Operating Base Kessler, 2 days before the team inserted into the Blackthorn Highlands. Quietly. He said it with the kind of confidence that comes from satellite imagery and signal intercepts and 14 layers of intelligence review. The kind of confidence that has never actually spent a night above 4,000 meters in wind that cuts through thermal layers like a blade through wet paper. 48 hours on the ground, Drayton had said, tapping the topographic map spread across the table in the briefing room. In and out, minimum footprint. The objective is intelligence recovery, not engagement. You go in, you pull the cache, you extract. Nobody knows you were ever there. 6 operators had nodded at that briefing. 6 trained professionals who knew better than to trust the word quietly when it came attached to a location like Blackthorn. But orders were orders. The Blackthorn Highlands sat at the northern edge of a contested mountain region that no government officially claimed and every armed faction desperately wanted. The terrain was brutal in every season. Knife-edged ridgelines, valleys that swallowed sound, elevations that made engines labor and lungs burn. But in early winter, it became something closer to hostile by design. Snowpack hid the trails that weren't already impassable. Cloud cover grounded air assets for hours at a stretch. And the abandoned fortress carved into the rock at elevation 4,200 meters, the one the locals called Darkhaven and the military called Objective Ridgeback, sat at the intersection of 3 converging valleys like a stone throne that nobody wanted to sit on. It had been a garrison post once. Centuries ago, during a war nobody alive remembered fighting. Now it was just walls and wind and the memory of something fortified. The insertion went clean. Halo drop at 0230, chutes popped low, all 6 operators on the ground within a half-mile scatter before dawn. They moved to the objective in silence, navigating by terrain feature and starlight, and reached the outer walls of Darkhaven just as the sky began to gray at the eastern ridgeline. Mason Hale took point on the approach, which was how he preferred it and how the team had come to expect it without discussion. He was the unit commander by rank and the first man through every door by habit, a combination that had earned him an ugly scar along his left jaw and an unspoken respect from every person who worked with him. He was 36 years old, built lean and hard from years at altitude, and he had the particular kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having made peace with it so long ago he could barely remember what it felt like fresh. Behind him came the team in practice spacing, Torres and Vega handling the flanks, Owen Briggs keeping pace near the center with the radio pack, Danny Ruck covering rear security, and Lena Mercer moving in a position slightly apart from the others. Not isolated, exactly, but separate in the way that snipers tend to be separate, already scanning angles that the rest of the team hadn't thought to look at yet. She had her rifle slung barrel down across her back and her spotter scope in her right hand, and she moved across the broken ground with a kind of unhurried economy that didn't look like speed until you tried to keep up with her. "Northeast corner looks compromised," she said quietly, her voice flat and without drama. "Top of the wall. See the gap?" Mason glanced where she indicated. The parapet along the northeast section had partially collapsed, leaving a section maybe 4 meters wide that opened onto the valley below. "Already on the list," he said, just making sure. They swept the interior in less than 10 minutes. The fortress was empty, had been empty for years, judging by the accumulated debris, the animal bones, the layers of wind-blown grit coating every surface. The intelligence cache was exactly where the mission brief said it would be, sealed in a waterproof container inside a collapsed section of the eastern wall, marked with a barely visible scratch pattern on the stone above it. Torres and Vega pulled the container while Briggs established radio contact with FOB Kessler. Ruck finished clearing the southern approach corridor. Mason studied the extraction route on his map while Lena climbed. She always climbed. The highest point of the remaining structure was a partial tower at the northwestern corner. 3 stories of deteriorating stone that leaned slightly inward at the top, as if gravity had been working on it for centuries and was starting to win. The staircase inside had partially collapsed, which meant the last 10 feet required pulling up through a gap in the floor using a rope she tied off around a surviving corbel bracket. From the tower top, she could see everything, both northern valleys. The eastern approach, the road that wound down from the southern pass, barely more than a track cut into the rock. The ridgelines above them on 3 sides. She set up her position methodically, bipod extended, scope adjusted for current light and estimated wind, ballistic data confirmed against her range card, spare magazines within reach. She'd been up here less than 3 minutes when she first heard it. Engines. Not one, multiple. Spread across different vectors, which meant she was hearing them from different valleys, which meant, hail. Her voice was calm through the radio. No elevation, no panic, just the word. Go, Mason said. We have vehicle movement, multiple sources. I'm counting at least 4 engine signatures. She paused, adjusting her scope toward the eastern valley where the sound was clearest. Make that 6, moving fast. There was a beat of silence below. How fast? 15 minutes, maybe 20 if the road slows them. She pulled back from the scope for a moment and looked at the sky. Cloud cover building from the northwest, wind picking up. Hail, they know we're here. Another silence, longer this time. How confident? The eastern track runs straight to this position and doesn't connect to anything else at this elevation. They're not hunting, they're coming. She resettled against the stalk. 3 separate valleys, coordinated timing. This isn't a patrol. She heard Mason exhale, a controlled sound, the kind of breath a man takes when he's processing bad information and won't let it show in his voice. Briggs, he said. Already on it, Owen Briggs called from somewhere below. The clatter of radio equipment being repositioned came through clearly. I've got Kessler on standby frequency, pushing the emergency extraction request now. What's the timeline on air support? A pause. Then, 40 minutes? Minimum. Nobody said anything to that. 40 minutes at this altitude, against multiple vehicle loads of armed fighters, with a compromised position and finite ammunition. The math didn't need explaining. Everyone in the unit could run those numbers in their sleep, and nobody needed the answer spoken out loud to understand what it meant. Mason's voice came through the radio again, steady and without performance. All right, we fortify. Mercer, you stay up. Already planned on it, she said. Becky? The next 18 minutes were controlled chaos of the particular variety that experienced soldiers recognize as productive. Everyone moving, everyone with a task, nobody wasting energy on fear that wouldn't help them anyway. Torres and Vega collapsed to the southern approach and began establishing a hasty defensive position at the main gate using broken stone and the remnants of an ancient wooden barrier that was mostly rot but partially still solid. Ruck took the eastern wall where the parapet remained highest and began rigging the one claymore they'd brought, a precaution, not an expectation, at the base of the exterior wall below his position. Briggs stayed near the center of the compound with his radio, working through the relay sequence to keep the emergency transmission clear, despite the terrain that kept trying to eat the signal. Mason moved constantly, checking positions, redistributing the spare magazines they had, calculating angles of fire and sectors of responsibility in a structure he'd had less than 20 minutes to actually study. He was doing it in his head without a whiteboard and without time, which was exactly the kind of problem he'd been trained to solve, and which he still found deeply unpleasant when the solution had to be good enough rather than correct. He stopped at the base of the northwest tower and looked up. Mercer. Her face appeared briefly at the gap in the parapet above. The light was wrong for her expression to be visible. The sun was behind the western ridge now, dropping fast. But he could see the outline of her and the rifle and the patience that seemed to come off her like a physical quality. Eastern Valley, she said without him asking. Lead vehicle just came around the bend below the snow line. I can confirm military pattern trucks. Open bed, standing fighters. At least 12 in that vehicle alone. Can you? Not yet. Range is still long for the wind conditions. A pause. 2 minutes. He almost said we don't have 2 minutes, but he didn't, because she knew that better than he did, and saying it wouldn't change the math, and she was already working the problem. Give me a count when you're ready, he said instead. You'll know, she said. He moved back toward the main position. The truck stopped about 800 meters out. 3 of them. That was the eastern approach. Across the valley, Lena had already identified 2 more sets of lights in the northern ravine and another column moving along the ridgeline track to the south. 6 vehicles minimum, possibly 8. The fighters were dismounting with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before, spreading out into assault formations, using the terrain for cover as they moved toward the fortress. She counted, kept counting. 70, 75. The number kept rising. She had 140 rounds across her 7 magazines. She did not think about what it meant that the numbers were already uncomfortably close to even. She focused on what she could do with what she had, which was the only kind of math that helped anyone in a position like this. The enemy field commander was easy to identify, the one with the radio moving between clusters of fighters, pointing and gesturing with the particular confidence of a man who believed he was orchestrating something simple. He was positioned behind a boulder about 640 meters out on the eastern approach, using it for cover in the way that people use cover when they're directing others to advance, and haven't yet internalized the concept that direction of fire can change. Lena confirmed her range, adjusted for the crosswind, which had dropped slightly in the last few minutes as the valley temperature equalized, breathed out slowly. Her finger found the trigger. Below, in the compound, Mason heard the first suppressed shot and felt the compression of it even at distance, the particular sound of precision fire as opposed to volume fire, a sound he'd heard enough times to recognize instantly. "She's on," Torres said from the gate position. "Stay in your sectors," Mason said. Don't shift to watch her work." He said it because he knew the temptation. There was something about Lena engaging that pulled the attention, the way a specific kind of skill pulls attention, the economy of it, the silence between shots, and they couldn't afford the distraction. On the eastern approach, the militia assault line stopped moving. Their commander had simply collapsed behind the boulder he'd been using for cover. No drama to it, no warning. One moment he was gesturing at a subordinate, and the next he was down, and the fighters nearest him didn't immediately understand what had happened because the shot had come from so far away, and the suppressor had kept the sound from directional clarity. The confusion that followed bought approximately 90 seconds. Lena used them. The machine gunner assigned to suppress the main gate was setting up his weapon on a tripod when her second round found him. The assistant gunner froze, wrong response, but an understandable one, and she moved past him, prioritizing the RPG team that was just coming around the northern edge of the boulder field. "Northern ravine," she said into the radio. "Second assault element is moving. 12 to 15 fighters. They're cutting toward your blind spot on the left." "Ruck," Mason said immediately. "Already turning," Ruck confirmed from the eastern wall. "Don't let them reach the—" "I see them, Hale. I've got them." It wasn't perfect. Nothing about the next hour was going to be perfect, and everyone in the compound understood that with the specific, settled clarity that comes from having no remaining alternatives. But perfect wasn't the requirement. The requirement was 40 minutes. Air support in 40 minutes. Lena shifted north, acquired, fired. A fighter who had been organizing the flanking element dropped at the edge of the ravine, and the element behind him stumbled in its advance, uncertain now where the fire was coming from, uncertain how many shooters were in the tower above them. That uncertainty was worth something. She intended to make it worth as much as she possibly could. Below her, the fortress that had stood abandoned for centuries began to hold again. The first coordinated push came 11 minutes after the trucks had stopped. She had been counting the enemy's movements with the patient attention that distinguished serious snipers from people who were simply accurate, understanding not just individual targets, but the systemic logic of how the assault was being organized, where the command nodes were, which elements were ready to move, and which were still positioning. An assault of this size against a fortified position required coordination. Coordination required communication. And communication, in a militia formation moving across open mountain terrain in low light, required people who were visible. Lena prioritized visible people. The second in command, She'd identified him by his radio handset and the way 3 separate fighters had converged on him for instruction in the 8 minutes since the commander went down, was trying to reorganize the eastern element from a position behind a ruined stone shepherd's shelter about 550 out. He'd moved twice, which told her he was conscious of exposure. She'd let him move both times because his movement kept the eastern element stationary. When he stopped moving and began pointing south, coordinating with the southern approach, which meant the 3-direction assault was about to go live, she put him down. The eastern element stalled again. "Hail!" Her voice was even. "They're about to run a simultaneous 3-direction push. Southern element is the furthest back. I'd say 3 minutes before they're all in position." "How are we looking on numbers?" Mason asked. She had been keeping count. It was imprecise. Darkness was building, the terrain was broken, and she was managing multiple vectors, but she had a working estimate. 60 plus still effective. Maybe 65. A beat. "I've been busy." "That you haven't," he said. It wasn't praise exactly, it was just an acknowledgement of a fact. But in the particular economy of language that operates under fire, it was enough. She cycled to the southern ridgeline, where the 3rd element had finally gotten its RPG team into position. The gunner was prone, his loader beside him, both of them protected by a low wall of stacked rock that someone had built, probably decades ago, for reasons entirely unrelated to combat. It gave them reasonable cover from the compound's firing positions. It did not give them cover from above. Her shot hit the RPG tube itself, not the gunner. The weapon spun out of his hands, and the round in the chamber discharged against the ground, the backblast catching the loader across the face and dropping him without Lena needing a second trigger pull. The RPG gunner scrambled away from his position. She let him go, prioritizing the squad leader behind him, who was already on his radio trying to push the timeline. Don't let them coordinate. That was the principle. An uncoordinated assault with 60 fighters was manageable. A coordinated one was not. Below, Vega's voice came through the position channel, tight and controlled. "Contact south. They're moving." "Hold," Mason said. "Let them come to effective range. They've got support fire. Hold, Vega." A pause. The sound of incoming rounds. Not accurate, but probing. The kind of suppressive fire meant to keep heads down while the assault element closed ground. "Mercer," Mason said. "Southern element." "Working it," she said. She was already shifted south, already acquiring, already working down the squad leaders and support weapon positions that were enabling the advance. It wasn't fast enough to stop the southern element from reaching 600 meters. It wasn't fast enough to stop the 2 fighters who reached the base of the southern wall and began looking for a breach point. But it was fast enough to drop the man who'd found one. Vega dealt with the second. The southern push stalled at the wall. Not stopped. Stalled. There were still fighters out there, still pressure, still incoming fire that was getting more accurate as the range shortened and the light failed. But the assault's momentum had broken again, and broken momentum in a night assault at altitude is one of the most expensive things to rebuild. "Briggs," Mason said. "Time check." 26 minutes, Briggs said. "Air support 26 out." 26 minutes. Lena loaded her 5th magazine. She heard it before she understood what she was hearing. A change in the pattern of movement below. Not the random chaos of fighters trying to advance, but something more deliberate. Quieter. Spread further apart. They were adapting. The militia commander was gone. His second was gone. Whoever had just taken command of the assault was thinking differently, which was more dangerous than the original approach had been. Less spectacular, less coordinated, but harder to systematically disrupt. Small groups, moving independently, using the terrain to break line of sight from the tower, not trying to rush the walls, trying to get close enough that rushes would no longer be necessary. She tracked 3 separate elements moving in the northern ravine, lost one behind a fold in the terrain, dropped one of the other 2. The third reached a boulder pile less than 280 meters from the north wall and stopped there, too close for comfortable engagement from her angle, hidden well enough that she couldn't guarantee a clean shot without burning time she didn't have. "Hail. North wall. Close. Behind the boulder cluster at your 270. "Got it," Mason said. His voice had gotten quieter in the last few minutes, which meant things were getting worse at the compound level. She could hear sporadic gunfire from below. The team was engaging now, not just Lena, which meant the perimeter pressure had reached the point where the main element needed to be directly in the fight. She shifted back east. Shot. Shifted north. Shot. The rhythm wasn't fast, she was not a machine gun, and the temptation to rush was something she'd been trained out of through years of discipline. But it was relentless. Every pause to assess cost the enemy a leader or a crew, served weapon, or a momentum builder. Every shot was chosen rather than reactive. She was managing a battlefield with a single rifle, and she was doing it by understanding that tempo was more important than volume. Then the armored technical appeared in the eastern valley. It came around the bend at the base of the approach road with its headlights off. Someone had thought to do that, which meant this new command authority was better than the last one. And it moved fast, its heavy machine gun traversing toward the compound. In the fading light, she could see the gunner standing in the bed, hands on the weapon's grips, the vehicle eating ground at a pace that would put it inside 300 meters within 2 minutes. A technical at 300 meters with a crew-served gun would end the compound's ability to defend the eastern wall. It would end Vega's position at the gate. It might end the gate entirely. She swung her rifle to it, ran the range calculation through her head, 480 meters, moving vehicle, low light, crosswind, and made the decision that had exactly one option, the engine block. She'd done it before, twice in her career, and she understood that it required a specific kind of commitment. You had to accept that you might hit the hood and not the engine, that vehicle construction might deflect the round, that one shot might not be enough, and a second shot would need to follow within 3 seconds before the vehicle moved out of the kill zone. She fired. The technical lurched. Not stopped, lurched, which meant she'd hit something. And she fired again before it could recover, this time lower, adjusting for the possibility that her first round had impacted the radiator rather than the engine itself. The vehicle veered left. Stopped. The gunner in the bed scrambled and went for the weapon anyway, traversing it toward the tower. She shot him before he found his angle, and the technical sat dead on the road with its crew out of the fight and the eastern advance now missing its most dangerous piece. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold stock of her rifle. 1 breath, 2. Then she lifted back to the scope. Hail. Technical is down. Eastern approach. But they're reorganizing. This new commander is smarter. A long pause before Mason's response. How many magazines left? She looked down at her kit. 2, she said. Plus what's in the rifle. Another pause. Longer. Briggs, Mason said. Not to her, to Briggs. 14 minutes, Briggs said. Air support 14 out. 14 minutes. She had approximately 80 rounds. She went back to work. But the assault that came in the 13th minute was not the uncoordinated rush of the first wave or the probing advances of the reorganized elements. It was something she recognized and respected even as she hated it. A deliberate, disciplined final push designed to overwhelm through simultaneous pressure at every vector, accepting casualties in exchange for ground, betting that the defender's ammunition would run dry before the attacker's numbers did. They came from 3 directions at once, not a few fighters at each angle, a wave, 40, 50 people moving at a sprint across the last 200 meters of open ground, using smoke grenades to break line of sight, using the noise and the volume of their own fire to suppress the defenders while the distance closed. Below, Lena heard Mason's voice cut through the radio traffic with the particular efficiency of someone making decisions faster than they can think about making them. Ruck, east wall. Torres, gate. Vega, south corner. Briggs, get on that radio and do not stop talking to Kessler. I'm on, Briggs said. The compound erupted. Not in panic, in the controlled, vicious, concentrated fire of people who understood they had one job right now, and that job was simple. Don't let them through. From above, Lena hunted the ones that would break the defense. Not the nearest fighters, not the most visible ones, the ones with the weight of the assault on their shoulders. The breachers, the support teams carrying ladders, the squad leaders driving the push forward with their bodies and their voices. She dropped them methodically, cycling through the remaining ammunition with the awareness of each round spent, each shot chosen. A man carrying a breaching charge reached the north wall, and she put him down at arm's length from the stone. An RPG gunner who'd somehow held his weapon through everything finally got a clean shot at the gate, and she hit him through the smoke a half-second before he fired, the rocket launching skyward instead of forward, the explosion going wide and high and harmless. Vega's voice, ragged and sharp. "They're on the south wall! 2 of them!" A shot, then another. "Clear," Vega said. Lena's rifle locked back on empty. She dropped the magazine, reached for her last one. Her hands were cold. She'd been up here for over 40 minutes in wind that had dropped below freezing, and the magazine seated on the second try rather than the first, which she noted without commentary because commentary required time she didn't have. "Briggs," she said, flat voice, no performance. "Give me a number." 90 seconds, Briggs said. "I hear them. 90 seconds. 90 seconds. She had 31 rounds. She went back to work. The Eastern assault had almost reached the gate when she dismantled its last coherent leadership. The push faltered, not stopped, faltered. Fighters who'd been sprinting suddenly uncertain, the momentum of their charge interrupted by the collapse of the men driving it. Torres at the gate poured fire into the gap that opened in their formation. The northern push was closer. Fighters had reached the base of the north wall and were trying to scale it. She couldn't engage them from her angle without a clean line of sight, which the wall itself denied her, and she heard Ruck dealing with it below, grunting with effort, the sharp crack of a pistol at close range where his rifle couldn't track. She had 17 rounds left when the sound she'd been waiting for began as a distant tremor in the air and built into something she felt more than heard. The particular approaching roar of fast movers dropping altitude, oriented on target, the sound of a 40-minute promise arriving with 16 seconds to spare. The radio crackled and Briggs's voice broke through the compound with something that wasn't quite composed but was the closest he'd been to composed all night. "Air support is 1 minute out. Kessler confirms strike package inbound. Lena, they need target marking. Laser designators on the largest concentrations." She was already reaching for the laser designator clipped to her kit. Around the fortress, the assault had not yet broken. Fighters were still moving, still pressing, still dying at the walls. But the sound in the sky was reaching them too, and the sound in the sky changed things, because everyone on that mountain knew what was coming next, and knowing changed the calculation in a way that numbers and commanders and tactical coordination couldn't fix. Lena painted the eastern concentration first, then the northern ravine, where the bulk of the reserve fighters had been staging, then the cluster of vehicles at the base of the approach road that had been feeding the assault with reinforcements. She was painting the third target when her radio picked up the sound of the strike package's lead aircraft acknowledging the laser designations. "Mercer," Mason said from below. "Yeah." "Good work." She didn't answer that, just kept the designator steady on the vehicles while the roar in the sky became the loudest thing in the valley. The first explosion lit the eastern slope like a second dawn. What? She watched it from the tower. The strike package working through the target packages she'd marked. The sky delivering in 4 precise, devastating passes what the fortress walls had been buying time for. Fire rolled across the northern ravine. The vehicle column at the base of the road erupted in a sequence of secondary explosions that shook the stone under her feet even at 400 meters. The southern approach went silent under a strike that scattered the reserve element in every direction simultaneously. The assault broke, not gradually, not in pieces. All at once, the way a thing breaks when it finally understands it isn't going to win, fast and total and without the coordination it had maintained throughout the fight. She stayed up in the tower until Mason called her down. "Extraction's here," he said. 2 minutes. Get down." She began breaking down her position. Magazine out. Empty. Bolt locked back, chamber clear. Bipod folded. She worked by touch more than sight because the light was nearly gone, but she'd broken down this rifle in darkness enough times that her hands remembered the sequence. She was halfway down the improvised rope when Briggs's voice came over the radio again. "Kessler is asking for a preliminary assessment. They want to know how we held the position." She heard Mason pause. "Tell them we had good position and better support," he said. "They're going to want more than that." "Then tell them we had a sniper." She reached the ground and found Mason waiting at the base of the tower. He looked at her for a moment, taking inventory the way commanders do after a fight, checking for damage, and then he nodded once. The helicopter was already on approach. its navigation lights visible against the black sky as it dropped into the valley with the specific urgency of a crew that understood what they were extracting from and wanted to leave. Torres had taken a graze across his left forearm. Not deep, not dangerous, but bleeding enough to need attention. Ruck had 3 cracked ribs from a fighter who'd gotten over the north wall and required close-quarters resolution before going down. Vega had a torn ligament in his right knee that he was not mentioning because the adrenaline was still carrying him and there was nothing to do about it, until they were out anyway. Briggs had a split lip from debris. Mason had a burned left hand from grabbing a piece of shrapnel-heated stone during the fight at the gate. Lena had cold hands and an empty rifle. She counted everyone twice before she climbed aboard, because she always counted everyone twice, because that was the kind of habit that felt unnecessary until the one time it wasn't. The helicopter lifted. Through the open door, she watched the fires below. The valley looked like something from a very old story. Orange light against black rock, smoke rising in columns toward a sky that had cleared while they were fighting and now showed stars with the indifferent clarity of altitude. Briggs leaned toward her from across the compartment, raising his voice over the rotor noise. "I got a preliminary count from the strike package assessment," he said. "They're calling it 90-plus fighters." She looked at him. 90, she said. "Give or take." She turned back to the door, watched the fire. 90 fighters and 6 operators in 40 minutes and 1 rifle. Ruck said something from the far side of the compartment and Torres laughed at it. A short, ragged sound, the kind of laugh that comes out when your body is still burning adrenaline and you need to put the energy somewhere. And Vega told them both to shut up because his knee was killing him now that the adrenaline was fading. Briggs was on the radio with Kessler, giving the preliminary report in the flat, procedural language of official communications, translating the last hour into the vocabulary of mission assessments and casualty reports and ammunition expenditures. Mason said nothing. He sat near the door opposite Lena and watched the mountains below, and let the wind come through the opening and didn't bother putting it into any kind of language because some things don't benefit from language, and this was one of them. Lena watched the fires until the helicopter's banking turn took the valley out of her sightline and replaced it with dark mountains and then stars, and then cloud cover as they dropped elevation and the Blackthorn Highlands fell away behind them. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. She was too cold and too aware, and her hands were starting to ache as the warmth of the cabin reached them. But she closed her eyes and let the rotor noise and the cold air and the rocking of the helicopter fill in everything else. And in that space between the end of the fight and whatever came after it, she let herself simply exist for a few minutes without counting anything. Outside, through the thin skin of the aircraft, the mountains held their silence. Below them, in the valley, the fires burned on. The debriefing at FOB Kessler started 4 hours later and ran until dawn. Colonel Drayden conducted it himself, which was unusual. He sat at the head of the table with a coffee that was going cold at his elbow and a preliminary intelligence report that he'd been annotating since the initial contact report came in. And he listened to Mason's account with the particular attention of someone who is hearing things that don't quite fit the shape of the operation he'd designed. When Mason finished, Drayden sat with the silence for a moment. 90 plus, he said. That's the strike package's estimate, Mason said. Conservative, probably. And your team held for 40 minutes. 42 by final clock. Drayden looked down at his notes. The intelligence cache is being analyzed now. Early assessment is it's worth considerably more than the operation's risk profile suggested. He paused. In retrospect, nobody in the room said anything to that. The preliminary engagement report credits 47 confirmed hostile casualties to Mercer's position, Drayden continued, reading from the document. He looked up. 47. Lena sat at the table 2 seats down from Mason. She hadn't slept. She had a cup of coffee that was also going cold, and she was staring at a point on the table that wasn't anything in particular. Is that number accurate? Drayden asked. Not to Mason, to her. She looked up. It's what the count showed, she said. I wasn't keeping careful records up there. No, Drayden said. I imagine you weren't. A beat. The enemy field commander, he said. Your opening shot. Yes. Within the first 30 seconds of engagement. Closer to 20. Drayden set down his pen, looked at her for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite what she'd expected from him. less analytical than it usually was, more human in a way that sat slightly uncomfortably on a man she'd always associated with planning and assessment and the management of acceptable risk. "I'm told," he said, "that you had 2 magazines remaining when the strike package arrived." "One and change. One and change." He repeated it, not quite to himself. "Against 90. She shrugged, not dismissively. It was a real shrug, the kind that means I know how it sounds and I don't have a better way to explain it than what happened. "We had a good position," she said. Mason made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Ruck, sitting against the wall with his ribs taped and his eyes half open, smiled at the ceiling. Drayden looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his pen. "The formal commendation process will take time," he said, "as it usually does. But I want to be clear, before this room disperses and everyone starts filling out the paperwork." He paused. "What was accomplished last night in that position was not ordinary. It will be in the record as such." Nobody cheered. Nobody made a speech. Torres nodded. Briggs stared at his hands. Vega was half asleep with his wrapped knee elevated on the chair beside him. Mason looked at Lena. She looked back at him. Then she picked up her coffee, which was cold, and drank it anyway, because she was exhausted and the briefing wasn't over yet, and there was still a great deal of paperwork that nobody in this room was going to enjoy. Outside, through the narrow windows of the briefing room, the mountains were turning pink with the first light of morning. Somewhere up in the Blackthorn Highlands, behind them now, the fires had finally gone out, but the walls of Darkhaven still stood. It was 3 weeks later when the Signals Intelligence report landed on Drayden's desk, with a notation that immediately elevated it to priority review. The militia's operational communications, intercepted in the days following the assault, contained a single fragment of enemy radio traffic that the signals team had flagged without fully understanding its significance. It had been transmitted by one of the surviving fighters during the retreat from the fortress, picked up by a relay station, and held in the intercept queue for days before a Dari-speaking analyst caught the context. The fragment read, in translation, "We don't know. There could have been 30 of them up there. We never found where all the fire was coming from." Drayden read it twice. Then he clipped it to the front of Mercer's commendation file, which was already considerably thicker than it had been 2 days ago. He wrote one note in the margin. 1 position, 1 rifle. He left the rest to the record. The commendation file sat on Drayden's desk for 11 days before anyone from Regional Command acknowledged it. On the 12th day, a lieutenant colonel named Gareth Stoll arrived at FOB Kessler from the Regional Assessment Division with a travel bag, a laptop, and the particular brand of bureaucratic energy that announces itself before the person carrying it has finished walking through the door. He was 43, trim in the way that desk officers maintain through gym routines rather than field work, and he had the kind of face that defaulted to skeptical the way some faces default to friendly, not as a choice, just as a resting condition. He requested Mercer's full service jacket within 20 minutes of arrival. Mason watched the request come through the admin channel and said nothing. He was standing in the operations room when Briggs handed him the notification, and he read it once, set it down on the console beside him, and went back to reviewing the route assessment he'd been working on. "You're not going to push back on that?" Briggs asked. "It's a legitimate request." "He's from Regional Assessment. I know where he's from." Briggs looked at him for a moment. "Regional Assessment doesn't review field commendations. That's not what they do." "No," Mason said. "It's not." He picked up the route assessment again. The conversation was over, not because there was nothing left to say, but because saying it out loud wouldn't change what was already in motion. Lena spent the first week after Blackthorn doing what she always did after an operation: maintenance, documentation, and the particular kind of enforced stillness that her body demanded after sustained high-stress engagement, and that her mind resisted with the irrational stubbornness of someone who doesn't entirely trust quiet. She cleaned her rifle twice, once functionally, once with the obsessive thoroughness of someone working through something that wasn't really about the rifle. She wrote her portion of the after-action report in the flat, precise language required by the form, translating 42 minutes of controlled violence into columns and checkboxes and estimated ranges. She ran every morning despite the cold. Not because she needed to. The base had a treadmill. but because running outside in cold air was something she'd done since she was 19 years old, and the habit had calcified past the point of being optional. On the 8th morning, Torres fell into step beside her. He was still favoring his left arm slightly where the graze had healed unclean, but he ran without mentioning it, which was standard. They ran in silence for a while. The mountains around FOB Kessler were lower than Blackthorn, and the air was correspondingly easier, and the sky was clear in a way that felt almost aggressive after the week of cloud cover they'd had. "Stoll's been in the records room," Torres said, "not building to anything, just placing the information." "I know," Lena said. 3 hours yesterday. Briggs told me. Torres was quiet for another quarter mile. His breathing was controlled and even, which was one of the things she'd always respected about him. He didn't perform effort, he just ran. "He pulled your Harkin Valley assessment," Torres said. "The formal one, with the board findings." She didn't break stride. "How do you know that?" "Because Ruck knows the records clerk, and the records clerk has opinions about people who ask for sealed documents without the right clearance tier. It's not sealed." "No," Torres said, "but it's flagged. There's a difference." She knew the difference. A sealed document required active authorization to access. A flag document just meant that access was logged, and the flag notation showed up in any subsequent review. It was a courtesy marker, not a security measure, a way of saying this file has context that matters without actually restricting anyone from reading it. The Harkin Valley assessment had been flagged at her request 4 years ago, after the Board of Inquiry concluded, and she'd been advised by her advocate that the flag would provide transparency protection. It meant that anyone reviewing her record would see the flag, see the board findings attached to it, and have the full picture rather than just the raw assessment numbers. She thought that was a reasonable precaution at the time. She was less certain about it now, thinking about Stoll in the records room for 3 hours. "What do you know about him?" she asked. Torres considered the question with the particular seriousness he brought to personnel assessments, which was one of the more useful things about him. "He closed the Ferris inquiry," Torres said, 2 years ago. "You remember Ferris?" She did. Ferris had been a team leader in a different unit, recommended for a senior commendation after an engagement in the Southern Corridor. The recommendation had sat in review for 8 months before Stoll's division concluded that the engagement metrics didn't meet the threshold criteria for the decoration level requested. Ferris had eventually received a lower commendation. He'd put in his separation papers 6 weeks later. She didn't say any of that. Torres knew it too. "He's thorough," Torres said. Not as praise, as a description of a particular kind of problem. They turned at the far marker and ran back toward the base without speaking again. Stoll requested a formal interview with Lena on the 10th day. The room he'd been given for his assessment work was a converted supply office near the admin block. Small, fluorescent lit, with a folding table and 4 chairs and the particular smell of spaces that are used occasionally for things they weren't designed for. He had a recorder on the table and a notepad beside it, and a copy of something in a folder that she couldn't read from across the table, but which was thick enough to be her full jacket or close to it. She sat down without being invited to. "Small thing," he noticed. "Sergeant Mercer." He opened the folder. "I appreciate you making time. I was told it wasn't optional." He looked up from the folder. "Who told you that?" "Nobody, specifically. But assessment interviews during a commendation review aren't something people decline." He considered that, wrote something in the notepad. She watched him write it without being able to read it, which was presumably intentional. "You understand why regional assessment is involved in this review," he said. "I understand that a commendation of this level requires additional verification." She paused. "I'd be more comfortable if I understood what specifically triggered the regional referral." "Standard protocol for—" "It's not standard protocol," she said. "The standard threshold for regional referral on a field commendation is a decoration at the Distinguished Service level or above. Colonel Drayden submitted at the achievement level with a notation recommending elevation. That notation is a recommendation, not a submission. Regional doesn't review recommendations." She kept her voice level. No aggression in it, just accurate. "So I'd like to understand what specifically triggered this." Stoll's pen stopped moving. He looked at her with a recalibrated attention, the look of someone who'd expected a particular kind of conversation and was now adjusting to a different one. "You've done some reading," he said. I've been here 11 days, she said. I had time. A beat. The engagement metrics from the Blackthorn action are unusual, he said. Unusual how? The confirmed hostile figures attributed to your position are, he consulted the folder. 47 confirmed with an estimated additional 9 probable based on the strike package's assessment. That's 56 potential attributions to a single operator over 42 minutes. He looked up. At altitude, in low-light conditions, against a moving assault. Yes, she said. The statistical distribution of those numbers is outside what the engagement modeling would project for a single-position sniper element. She was quiet for a moment. The engagement modeling, she said carefully, is built on data from standard operating environments. Blackthorn wasn't a standard operating environment. Agreed. Which is why we're here. He set down his pen. I'm not accusing you of anything, Sergeant. I want to be clear about that. I'm trying to understand the mechanics of what happened so the record reflects accurately. The record already reflects accurately. Mason's after action, Torres's supplemental, Briggs's radio log, they're all consistent. They are, he said. That's not what I'm questioning. Then what are you questioning? He opened the folder to a different section. She recognized the tab, Harkin Valley, the flagged assessment. 4 years ago, he said, you were the subject of a board of inquiry following an engagement in the Harkin Valley sector. He didn't phrase it as a question. That's in the record. The board found that your engagement metrics during that operation were also significantly outside projected parameters. He looked up. The board's finding was that the metrics were accurate, that there was no misconduct, but that, he read directly from the document, the operational context was insufficiently documented to allow for complete metric verification. The fluorescent light hummed above them. That's what the board found, she said. Yes. The insufficiency notation wasn't a finding of misconduct, he said, but it does create a pattern consideration when a similar metric anomaly appears in a subsequent review. She understood what he was doing. It wasn't improper. It wasn't even unfair in a strict procedural sense. He was connecting 2 data points that genuinely existed in her record, applying a reasonable analytical framework, and arriving at a conclusion that was legitimately within his authority to arrive at. It was also going to kill the commendation. Not immediately. Not in this room. He would write his assessment, include the pattern notation, forward it to the regional board, and the regional board would apply the same framework and conclude that the Blackthorn metrics required additional verification before the commendation could be elevated. Additional verification on field engagement metrics was a process that took months and frequently concluded without resolution because the evidence required additional witness accounts, supplementary documentation corroborating tactical data, was inherently difficult to gather after the fact. The commendation would sit in review. Drayden would be told the elevation recommendation was pending, and the pending would become permanent in the way that pending always became permanent when no one was pushing it forward. She thought about all of this in the time it took Stoll to refill his coffee from the thermos on the table beside him. Do you have any documentation from Blackthorn that supplements the after-action report? He asked. Personal notes? Range cards? Shot logs? My range card, she said. I always keep my range card. Can you provide a copy? Yes. Anything else? She was quiet for a moment. There were 3 suppressed shot signatures caught on Briggs's radio audio during an open-channel transmission at the 14-minute mark, she said. The signal analysis should show the interval timing. The intervals are consistent with deliberate single-target acquisition, not area fire. She paused. That's not in any of the written reports because nobody asked for it, but the audio log exists. Stoll looked at her. That kind of analysis would take time, he said. Yes, she said. It would. The implication sat between them without either of them naming it. She stood up. I've been in this unit for 6 years, she said. Not hostile, not emotional, just information delivered with the same flatness she used for range data. I've been downrange 11 times. I've never had a finding of misconduct, never had an accuracy dispute that wasn't resolved by the record, and the Harkin Valley Board concluded there was no misconduct. She picked up her cap from the table. The insufficiency notation was about documentation procedure, not about what happened. I understand that. I don't think you do, she said. but that's not something I can fix in this room. She left. Mason was waiting outside, not because he'd known when she'd be done. He'd been walking past the admin block on the way to the motor pool and seen the light on in the supply office and stopped, which was the kind of thing he didn't examine too carefully because the examination would require acknowledging it was deliberate. She walked out and he fell into step beside her without comment. They walked for half a minute before she said anything. He pulled Harkin Valley. I figured he would. He's going to use the pattern notation. Probably. She stopped walking. They were between buildings in a corridor of wind and shadow, and she turned to face him with the directness she brought to most things. What do you know about Stoll that you haven't told me? Mason was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was deciding how much of the true answer to give, rather than whether to give it at all. He was in Harkin Valley, Mason said, not in the sector, at Regional during the inquiry. She stared at him. He was a junior assessment officer then, Mason continued. He wasn't primary on the board, but he was in the building. You knew this. I found out 4 days ago. That's not the same as now. No, he said. It's not. She turned away and started walking again. He let her get 6 paces ahead before he said the thing he'd been deciding whether to say. The board's finding at Harkin Valley wasn't unanimous. She stopped again, slower this time. What? The insufficiency notation was a compromise, he said. The primary board member wanted a clean finding, no misconduct, metrics accurate, documentation deficiency noted but non-material. 2 of the 3 board members agreed. He paused. The 3rd filed a dissent. She turned around. The dissent isn't in the file, she said. Dissents below a certain review threshold get summarized, not appended. He met her eyes. I pulled the summary 3 days ago. The dissenting member had concerns about the accuracy of specific metric attributions. He recommended extended review. And this dissenting member, Mason said the name. She heard it, and her face did something complicated that she controlled before it finished happening, and she looked at Mason for a long moment without speaking. He's still in Regional, she said. Deputy Director now, Mason said. Assessment Division. Stoll's direct superior. She looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. Does Drayden know? I briefed him this morning, Mason said. He's looking at what he can do, which may not be much. He said the last part without softening it, because she wouldn't want it softened. The review process has legitimate standing. Even if the personnel connection is a problem, it's not automatically disqualifying. No, she said, it wouldn't be. The wind moved between the buildings. Somewhere across the base, an engine turned over and caught. The audio log from Briggs's radio, Mason said. I already requested the signals archive pull. It'll be ready in 2 days. She looked at him. You requested it before the interview. I requested it 4 days ago. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. It might not be enough, he said. I want you to understand that. Even with the audio analysis, Stoll has a legitimate framework. The pattern notation is a real thing he's allowed to apply. I know. And the process takes time. Drayden's commendation will sit. I know that too. He nodded once. What are you going to do? He asked. She thought about that. The question was real. He was actually asking, not rhetorically, not to prompt a response he already knew. He wanted to know where her head was. The same thing I always do, she said. Which is? Work, she said. Keep working. Let the record be what it is. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not quite admiration, not quite concern. Something between the two that had no name she'd ever found for it. Ruck wants to know if you're coming to Chow, he said. Tell him yes. She started walking. He fell back into step beside her, and they walked the rest of the way across the base in silence, which was how most of the important conversations they'd ever had ended. The signals archive came back in 31 hours, not 48, because Briggs called in a favor with the technical unit that had no official name and processed requests at whatever speed the person asking them could negotiate. Lena sat with the audio analyst, a staff sergeant named Priya Wellen, who'd been working signals interpretation for 9 years and who had the particular gift of explaining what she was hearing without condescension, and listened to the extracted segment 3 times. The open channel transmission was 40 seconds long. Background noise from the compound. Stone, wind, the intermittent crack of small arms fire from the defensive positions, and beneath it, at intervals, the suppressed shot signatures from the tower, each one a distinctive brief compression in the audio, different enough from the surrounding ambient noise to isolate. Wellen had already done the interval analysis. 4.2 seconds between the first and second, she said, pointing at the waveform on her screen. 6.8 between the second and third. The 6-8 gap is longer, wind shift probably, or acquisition on a moving target. Moving target, Lena said. Northern ravine. The intervals are consistent with independent target acquisition on each shot, not rapid fire, not area suppression. Each shot preceded by a distinct pause phase. Wellen looked at her. The pause phases show breath cycle timing. I can document that. Can you express that as an accuracy confidence metric? Wellen thought about it. Not standard, but I can produce a formal technical analysis that defines the shot pattern and compares it to establish single-shooter engagement signatures. She paused. It won't give Stoll a number, but it'll make the record harder to dismiss. That's enough, Lena said. She was walking out when Wellen said, You know this doesn't fix Harkin Valley. Lena stopped in the doorway. No, she said. It doesn't. Is that going to be a problem? She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she considered things. It's been a problem for 4 years, she said. I've managed. She walked back out into the thin winter air. The mountains were sharp against the afternoon sky, and the base was loud with the ordinary noise of people moving through another day, and somewhere in an admin office across the compound, Stoll was writing his assessment in the careful language of a man who understood exactly what his words would build and what they would close. She ran her hand along the cold exterior wall of the signals building as she passed it. A habit she'd had since Harkin Valley, touching surfaces when her mind started running faster than her feet could manage, an anchor to physical specificity. The wall was rough concrete, cold through her palm. She pulled her hand back and kept walking. There was a debrief with Drayden in 2 hours. She needed to eat before then, and she needed to think, and she needed to do both of those things without letting the part of her brain that knew exactly how badly this could go get enough oxygen to run its full calculation. 4 years was a long time to carry a flagged file. It wasn't, she'd learned, long enough to stop feeling the weight of it. Drayden's office had a window that faced the eastern ridgeline, and in the 2 hours between her conversation with Wellen and the debrief, the light had changed from afternoon white to the particular amber that came before mountain dusk, the kind of light that made everything look more significant than it probably was. Drayden sat behind his desk. Mason was in the chair to the left. Stoll had been invited and had declined, which told Lena something about where his assessment already stood. She sat down and waited. Drayden had the signals analysis on his desk. He'd had it for 40 minutes, which meant he'd read it twice. He was a thorough reader. Wellen's analysis is solid, he said. I've already forwarded it to the commendation file as supplementary documentation. And Stoll? Lena asked. Has been informed it exists. Drayden set the document down. He acknowledged receipt. He hasn't withdrawn the pattern notation. She'd expected that. She nodded. His assessment goes to regional in 72 hours, Drayden continued. Once it's submitted, the review timeline is out of my hands. The commendation elevation sits pending until regional clears it, which, he stopped, started again. Could take considerable time. How considerable? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Mason shifted in his chair. There's a review board cycle in 4 months. If it makes that cycle, we have a decision by summer. If it doesn't make the cycle, it goes to the next one, Lena said, which is another 6 months. Yes. She looked at the window. The amber light was fading. The personnel connection, she said. Stoll and the Harkin Valley descent. Is that going anywhere? Drayden's expression did something careful. I've raised the concern with the regional oversight coordinator. It's been logged. He paused. Logged doesn't mean actioned. No, she said. It doesn't. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a vehicle moved across the compound, its engine sound briefly filling the silence and then passing. There's something else, Drayden said. The way he said it made Mason look up. Regional is attaching a performance review to the assessment cycle. Drayden kept his voice neutral. Standard protocol for any operator whose metrics are under active evaluation. A performance review, Lena said. A field evaluation. Live exercise, controlled environment, objective scoring. He met her eyes. It's not punitive. It's procedural. It's both, she said. Not angry, just accurate. Drayden didn't argue with that. When? She asked. They want it scheduled within 30 days. Mason made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He caught himself and converted it into clearing his throat, but she'd already heard it. Who runs it? She asked. Regional assessment assigns the evaluation team. Drayden hesitated. I requested approval to have an independent evaluator present. That request is pending. So Stoll's division would run the evaluation that would feed into Stoll's assessment. She processed that without putting any of it into her face. All right, she said. Drayden looked at her carefully. Lena. She waited. You held a position against 90 fighters for 42 minutes, he said. That is in the record. That is documented. That is real. And whatever this process does or doesn't do in the next few months, that doesn't change. She appreciated it. She also understood that the record being accurate and the record producing the correct outcome were two different things, and the distance between them was exactly where careers went to develop slow, untreatable problems. I know, she said. She stood up, and Drayden stood with her, and they shook hands across the desk in the particular way of people who are on the same side of something and understand they may not have the same tools to fight it with. She walked out into the evening. The 30 days passed in the specific texture of waiting, not empty, but colored throughout by the awareness of something approaching. She ran. She trained. She worked through the range qualification cycles with the particular focus of someone who understood that every measurable thing in her record was going to matter, and who refused to let any of them slip. Ruck drilled with her twice a week, calling positions and distances from a randomized card, keeping the engagements irregular so they didn't calcify into pattern. Torres didn't say much about any of it. He ran with her in the mornings and sometimes said something useful, and mostly just showed up, which was its own form of statement. Briggs continued working the signals archive, looking for anything else in the Blackthorn audio record that might supplement the analysis. He found 2 additional shot signatures in a segment they hadn't initially prioritized. A transmission from the 23rd minute, when the assault was at its densest, and forwarded the analysis to Wellen without telling Lena first because he wanted to have something concrete before raising her expectations. She found out anyway. She usually found out. You should have told me, she said. I didn't want to get your hopes up on something that might not... Briggs. Yeah. Tell me when things happen. Okay, he said. Yes. Sorry. What did Wellen find? 3 additional confirmed single-target acquisition signatures in that segment. She can document them. He paused. It's not going to move Stoll. No, she said. But it might move someone else. She didn't explain further, and he understood he wasn't going to get more than that. So he went back to his radio equipment. And she went back to the range. And neither of them mentioned it again. The evaluation team arrived on a Tuesday, which was the least dramatic day of the week, and therefore the one she'd half expected. 3 people. A major from regional named Coates, who ran the administrative side of field evaluations and who seemed professionally detached in a way that read as genuine rather than performed. A technical scorer named Adler, who carried a tablet and spoke mainly in numerical increments. And a third evaluator who walked off the vehicle last, and whom she recognized 2 seconds before she was sure she was right about recognizing him, which was 2 seconds of unpleasant uncertainty she could have done without. Captain Ren Calloway. She had not seen Ren Calloway in 4 years. He had been a first lieutenant during Harkin Valley, attached to the support element, and he had given testimony at the Board of Inquiry that was procedurally neutral and substantively unhelpful in the specific way of testimony that declines to corroborate without actively contradicting. He had aged in 4 years the way some people aged, better than the time deserved, which was irritating on principle. He saw her register his presence and had the decency not to pretend she hadn't. Mercer, he said. Calloway, she said. Major Coates looked between them with the expression of someone who has just identified a variable he wasn't briefed on. You 2 have history, he said. Same sector, 4 years ago, Calloway said. Different elements. Professional history, Coates said. Not quite a question. Yes, Lena said. Calloway nodded once. Coates looked at his tablet, made a note, and moved on to the evaluation briefing with the efficiency of a man who had learned to document complications before they became problems. The field evaluation ran across 2 days. Day 1 was technical. Static range work at known and unknown distances, crosswind conditions, time pressure sequences. Nothing she hadn't done 100 times. She shot it clean. Not perfectly, because perfect wasn't realistic, and she'd learned years ago to distrust perfect performances in high-stakes evaluations. The way a 2-round number on a financial report made auditors look twice, but clean and consistent and within every standard the scoring criteria required. Adler entered numbers, Coates observed. Calloway stood to the side and watched with his arms crossed and his face doing nothing useful. At the end of day 1's range work, she scored in the 97th percentile against the evaluation rubric. Adler showed her the number without comment. She went back to her quarters and didn't celebrate, because the second day was the problem. Day 2 was a live exercise. Simulated hostile engagement, dynamic environment, moving targets, time pressure, and the particular cruelty of evaluation scenarios designed to stress test decision-making rather than mechanics. It was the kind of exercise she was good at. She was also aware that evaluation scenarios were designed by people, and people made choices about what to stress test, and those choices could be architectural or they could be pointed. She found out which at 06:30 on day 2. Coates briefed the scenario in the operations room with Adler and Calloway flanking him and Mason standing against the back wall, because he had insisted on observing, and Coates had technically lacked the authority to exclude him. The scenario is a modified Kessler 7 format, Coates said. Single operator reconnaissance position under dynamic assault, multiple threat vectors, time-limited extraction window. Duration is 30 minutes, simulated. He pulled up the terrain schematic on the wall display. Elevation exercise. The position is at the Northern Training Ridge. The Northern Training Ridge. She knew it. She'd run it 3 times in the last month. Not because she'd anticipated this, but because it was in the rotation and she'd been running everything in the rotation. The elevation was 3,400 meters. Lower than Blackthorn by 800 meters, which meant the wind behavior would be different and the air pressure would be different, and anyone calibrating their expectations based on Blackthorn would be working from approximately similar but not identical conditions. She caught Calloway looking at her while Coates briefed the target sequence. She looked back at him, held it for 2 seconds, then returned her attention to the schematic. Target acquisition will be scored on accuracy, sequence prioritization, and decision timing, Adler said, reading from the rubric. Scenario includes 6 primary threat designates and 4 secondary designates. Scoring values are weighted by threat classification. What's the threat classification methodology? She asked. Adler looked up from his tablet. Evaluator discretion, he said. Threat designates are classified in real time by the scenario controller. She processed that. So the scoring weight of each target is determined during the exercise by the scenario controller, she said. Not predetermined. Correct. Who's the scenario controller? Coates said. Captain Calloway. The operations room was quiet for approximately 3 seconds. She turned and looked at Mason. He was already looking at her. His expression was doing the thing where it showed nothing, which meant he'd known this was coming and had been deciding whether to warn her and had landed on not warning her because the warning would have looked like an instruction and she didn't need instructions. She turned back to Coates. I'd like to note for the evaluation record that Captain Calloway and I have prior professional history that may constitute an evaluator conflict. Coates looked at her, then at Calloway, then at his tablet. The assignment was made by regional assessment, he said. I don't have the authority to. I'm not asking you to change the assignment, she said. I'm asking you to note the conflict in the record. A pause. I can do that, Coates said. Thank you. She picked up her rifle case. I'll be at the staging point, she said, and walked out. The Northern Training Ridge in early morning was cold in a way that went through layers. Not the wind-chill cold of Blackthorn, but the settled permanent cold of rock that held winter in its core long past the season. She reached the evaluation position, a natural overlook with a partial stone berm, designated Position Alpha on the scenario map, with 14 minutes to spare before the exercise started. She used the time the way she always used setup time, methodically, without rushing, checking everything that needed checking twice, and the things that mattered most 3 times: bipod, scope, wind reading, light conditions, range estimation on the 4 primary approach vectors she could identify from the terrain. The earpiece crackled. "Evaluator control online," Calloway's voice said. "Scenario begins in 90 seconds. Mercer, acknowledge." "Acknowledged," she said. A beat. 90 seconds, he said again. She didn't respond to the repetition. The scenario opened with 2 simulated threat designates advancing from the eastern approach. Standard opening, designed to orient the shooter and establish baseline. She acquired both within 11 seconds and indicated acquisition through the laser marker system the evaluation used instead of live fire. Adler's tablet would record the hits. 2 primaries acquired, Calloway said. First designate classified Alpha Tier. Second designate classified Gamma Tier. She noted the classification without reacting to it. Alpha Tier was maximum point value. Gamma was the lowest primary classification. Acquiring a Gamma Tier target over a higher value target carried a penalty in the rubric for incorrect prioritization. Even if both were acquired, the sequence mattered. The problem was that both targets had appeared simultaneously, with identical movement profiles and no visible differentiation that would indicate threat level. In a real engagement, she would have prioritized based on weapons carried, position relative to cover, and rate of advance. The simulated targets were identical in all 3. Calloway was classifying retroactively, assigning threat levels after acquisition, which allowed him to penalize any sequence she chose based on whichever target she'd hit first. She was aware this was happening. She continued working. 3 more designates appeared at the northern approach. She acquired them in sequence, moving fastest to slowest based on rate of advance. Calloway called the classifications 40 seconds later, after she'd already engaged all 3. 2 of them were classified in reverse priority order from her sequence. She kept her breathing even and worked the scenario. 22 minutes in, with 4 primary designates down and the scoring already shaped in ways she couldn't fully know until Adler tallied it, a new element entered the scenario. Scenario modification, Calloway said. Additional primary designate Eastern Ridge moving. She shifted east. Acquired the moving target at 310 meters, the farthest range in the exercise, and tracked it across the ridgeline with the patience required for a moving target at distance and variable wind. Target classification Alpha Tier, Calloway said. You have 10 seconds. She was already tracking. The wind read was wrong. A gust had moved the flag at the eastern marker and then died, creating a momentary lull that would affect the shot if she fired now. She waited 2 more seconds for the wind to stabilize. 8 seconds, she held. 6. The flag went still. She fired. The laser marker registered the hit. Clean, center mass on the moving target at 310 meters in crosswind. Silence from the control channel. Then, acquired. She shifted back to her primary sectors. 2 remaining secondary designates appeared from the southern approach, and she handled them in sequence, clean, within the time window. The scenario ended at the 30-minute mark with Coates's voice cutting in. Exercise complete. Stand down. She lowered the rifle. Her hands were cold. She pressed them flat against her thighs and let the rock under her absorb the rest of the adrenaline while she breathed through it. The earpiece was quiet for almost 3 minutes. Then Calloway's voice, and something in it had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to specifically, but she'd spent 4 years learning the particular vocabulary of that voice, and she caught it. Mercer, return to the evaluation point for scoring review. Adler read the numbers without inflection, which was professional. The sequence penalties from Calloway's retroactive classifications had cost her 22 points. Her raw accuracy score, hits per attempt, deviation from center, timing on the moving target, was in the 94th percentile. The weighted score after the sequence adjustments dropped her to the 81st. The 81st percentile was within the passing threshold. It was not exceptional. It was the kind of number that went into a file and provided Stoll with exactly the ambiguous data point he needed to maintain the pattern notation without overextending it. She looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then she looked at Calloway. He was standing across the evaluation table with his arms at his sides and his expression doing the nothing it had been doing all day. The sequence classifications, she said. They were assigned post-acquisition. The rubric allows evaluator discretion on classification timing, Calloway said. It allows it, she said. It doesn't specify post-acquisition as the standard. The implied standard is pre-designation, because post-acquisition classification can affect shooter decision-making and therefore doesn't test prioritization. It only tests the evaluator's ability to penalize retroactively. Coates looked at Calloway. Calloway said, "The rubric—" "I know what the rubric says," she said. "I'm telling you what it means." She kept her voice flat and without performance. "The sequence penalty is based on a methodology that produced unverifiable results, and I want that noted in the evaluation record alongside the conflict notation from this morning." Coates wrote something on his tablet. Calloway's jaw tightened. Barely, but she'd been looking at his face for 2 days and she caught it. "The evaluation is complete," he said. "Scores are final pending review." "Pending regional review," she said. "Not pending your review." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Regional." She picked up her rifle case. "Then I'll wait for regional," she said. She was halfway to the door when he said her name. Not her rank, her name. She stopped. She didn't turn around. "For what it's worth," he said, and the something that had shifted in his voice earlier had shifted further. That shot on the moving target at 6 seconds, 310 meters, in that wind. She waited. "I've been running evaluation exercises for 3 years," he said. "I've never seen that shot made on a 10-second clock." The room was very quiet. She turned around slowly and looked at him across the table. His face had finally stopped doing nothing. What it was doing instead was harder to categorize. Not guilt, not admiration, something that lived between the two and didn't resolve cleanly into either. "Then put it in the record," she said. She walked out. What happened next happened in the time it takes institutional machinery to process a contradiction it wasn't built to handle. Coates filed the evaluation report that afternoon. He included the conflict notation, the post-acquisition classification methodology objection, and, in a section he'd added that wasn't part of the standard template, a verbatim account of Calloway's final statement about the moving target shot. He sent the report directly to the regional oversight coordinator. He did not CC Stoll. That omission was either an oversight or a decision, and people who worked with Coates understood that he did not have oversights. The oversight coordinator's name was Colonel Miriam Faust, and she had been in her position for 7 years and had developed in that time a particular sensitivity to evaluation reports that contained more conflict notations than a standard review should generate. She read Coates's report on the same evening it was filed and made 3 phone calls before midnight. The first was to Regional Assessment's Legal Division. The second was to the commanding officer of FOB Kessler, who was Drayden. The third was to an office that Stoll's division reported to, but did not run. By the following morning, when Lena was on her 6th mile of the day's run, and Torres was keeping pace beside her without knowing why she was running harder than usual, the review process that Stoll had constructed over 11 days had developed a structural problem it hadn't had the night before. She didn't know any of this yet. She was just running, her breath clouding in the cold air, the mountains around FOB Kessler holding their silence the way mountains always did. Indifferent to the paperwork below them, indifferent to the machinery of institutional decisions, exactly as permanent and exactly as unmoved as they'd been, while 60 fighters advanced across open ground toward a stone fortress, and one woman held a position she had no reason to hold except that leaving was not something she knew how to do. Torres said nothing for another mile. Then, "You're going to wear a hole in the road." "I'm fine," she said. "You're running like you're trying to leave something behind." She was quiet for 2 steps. "Maybe," she said. He let it sit there. "Whatever Coates filed," Torres said, "Briggs heard it went directly to the oversight coordinator." She kept running. "How does Briggs know that?" she said. "Briggs knows everything." "He needs a hobby." "He has a hobby," Torres said. "This is it." She almost laughed. Not quite, but close enough that Torres heard the shape of it and nodded to himself. They ran the last mile in silence, and the morning opened up around them cold and clear and full of the particular uncertainty of things that hadn't yet resolved but were moving finally, in a direction that felt like it had weight behind it. Colonel Faust arrived at FOB Kessler on a Thursday, which nobody had been told to expect. She came in on the same logistics flight that brought replacement radio equipment and 2 new personnel attachments. and she walked off the ramp with a travel bag and a leather document case, and the particular bearing of someone who has spent enough years in institutional authority that they no longer feel the need to announce themselves through anything other than presence. She was 51, gray at the temples in a way she'd stopped doing anything about, and she had the kind of eyes that processed rooms the way certain people process rooms, taking inventory before committing to any of it. Drayden met her on the flight line. Lena watched from across the compound, not because she'd been waiting for anything but because she was returning from the range and the flight line was visible from the path back, and the woman walking off that aircraft with a leather document case was not logistics personnel. She went to find Mason. He was already on his way to find her. They met in the corridor between the operations block and the admin wing, which was an unremarkable place to receive unremarkable information and a slightly surreal place to have the kind of conversation they were about to have. "Faust," she said. "Regional oversight," he confirmed. "Personal visit." "That doesn't happen for a standard review." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He looked at her with the expression that meant he had more information and was deciding the order to give it in. "Stoll was pulled from the assessment yesterday," he said. "Temporarily reassigned pending conflict review." She heard that. "Let it settle." "And his superior," she said. "The deputy director, the one who filed the Harkin Valley dissent." "Also under review," Mason said. "Faust's office opened the conflict investigation 2 days ago based on Coates's report." She leaned against the corridor wall. Not from exhaustion. She wasn't exhausted, but because standing in the middle of a corridor while processing this information seemed structurally wrong. "That's not nothing," she said. "No," Mason said. "It's not nothing. It's also not finished." "Also not finished," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "What does she want?" Lena asked. "A meeting." He paused. "With you, this afternoon." "Matt." Drayden's office had been lent to Faust for the duration of her visit, which was either a courtesy or a signal about the relative weight of their respective authorities, and possibly both. Drayden sat in the chair that was normally reserved for visitors, which confirmed the second interpretation. Lena sat across from Faust and understood within 90 seconds that this was not the kind of meeting that was built around making her comfortable. It wasn't adversarial either. It was something more specific than both of those. The kind of meeting where someone with genuine authority has already read everything relevant and wants to understand what the documents don't capture. Faust opened without preamble. "You objected to the post-acquisition classification methodology during the field evaluation." "Yes," Lena said. "Walk me through the objection, not the procedural argument, the practical one." Lena looked at her for a moment to confirm the question was genuine. It was. "If you assign threat classifications after a shooter is already engaged," Lena said, "you're not testing the shooter's prioritization judgment. You're testing whether the evaluator can construct a retroactive penalty. Those are different things. The rubric is designed to test the first. Callaway used it to do the second." "And you believe that was intentional?" "I believe the result was consistent with an intentional approach." A beat. "I can't speak to his interior reasoning." Faust wrote something. "That's a careful answer." "It's an accurate one." Faust looked up. "The moving target acquisition at 310 meters on a 6-second clock." She checked her document. "Callaway included a supplementary note about it in the record. Voluntarily." "I know." "That surprised you?" It wasn't a question, but Lena treated it like one. "Yes." "Why?" She considered the honest answer and decided that honesty was the only thing worth offering in this room. "Because his history with my record didn't suggest he'd volunteer anything in my favor," she said. Faust nodded slowly. "Harkin Valley." "Yes." "Tell me about Harkin Valley." She said it simply, without prosecutorial weight. "Just tell me." "Not the board's version. Yours." Lena looked at the window. The eastern ridgeline was sharp against a blue sky, and she thought about how many times she'd looked at that ridgeline in the last 6 weeks and found it doing nothing useful and found it anyway. "We had a 3-man security element on the eastern ridge," she said. "I was the sniper attachment. The element lead was a lieutenant named Carver. We were holding a support by fire position during a ground assault that went longer than the planning window anticipated." Faust waited. "The ground element came under fire from a position on the northern slope. Elevated, good cover. crew-served weapon. The assault was going to fail without the position being neutralized. She paused. The northern slope position was outside my designated sector. Carver had the authority to authorize cross-sector engagement, but he was managing two other crises simultaneously. So you engaged without authorization, Faust said. I engaged with what I assessed was implied authorization based on mission priority, Lena said, which is a distinction that matters operationally and apparently doesn't matter procedurally. The board found the engagement itself was justified. They found the outcome was acceptable. She kept her voice even. They found the documentation of my decision process was insufficient to verify that I'd followed correct authorization procedure. Those aren't the same thing. No, Faust said, they're not. The dissenting board member, the one who recommended extended review, was Calloway's direct superior as of 18 months ago. She let that sit for a second. I didn't know that connection existed when the board convened. I found out 6 weeks ago. Faust looked at her steadily. How did that feel? The question was unexpected enough that Lena didn't have an immediate answer ready, and the lack of an immediate answer was itself informative. Like a lot of things made more sense than they had before, she said finally, and like that didn't particularly help me. Faust closed the document case. Not finished, just setting down the formal materials, marking a transition. I'm going to tell you where this stands, she said, and I want you to listen to all of it before you respond. All right. Stoll's conflict is procedurally disqualifying for this assessment. His pattern notation will be struck from the commendation review file. That's already determined. She held up one finger. That doesn't automatically resolve the review. Without Stoll's assessment, the commendation file is incomplete. It goes back to the beginning of the regional review cycle. Lena absorbed that. The deputy director's involvement in Harkin Valley is being reviewed separately, Faust continued. That review will take time. It may or may not produce findings that affect the Harkin Valley notation in your file. Second finger. No promises. I understand. Coates' evaluation report stands. Your scores stand. The supplementary notation from Calloway stands. She paused. The field evaluation scoring methodology objection is being reviewed by the Rubric Standards Committee, which means the post-acquisition classification issue may have implications beyond your case. Lena said nothing. What I can tell you today, Faust said, is that the process that was being used against you has been disrupted. What I cannot tell you is that the process from here will be fast or clean, or that it will produce the outcome the Blackthorn record warrants. She met Lena's eyes directly. I don't make promises I can't keep, but I'm here, in person, which should tell you something about how seriously this office is taking what's in that commendation file. The room held the silence for a moment. Can I ask you something? Lena said. Yes. Calloway's supplementary note. The one about the moving target shot. She chose her words. Did he file that before or after he knew your office was involved? Faust looked at her with an expression that was almost, not quite, but almost something warm. Before, she said, by approximately 6 hours. Lena nodded once. She didn't know what to do with that about Calloway, so she filed it in the category of things she'd figure out later and returned her attention to the immediate. What do you need from me? She asked. Nothing right now, Faust said. Stay available. If the Harkin Valley Review needs supplementary testimony, I'll contact you directly. She paused. And keep doing whatever you've been doing. The Blackthorn record is not the problem. It's the solution. She told Mason in the motor pool because that's where she found him, and she told him standing between two vehicles with the smell of diesel and cold metal around them, and the particular intimacy of an unscheduled conversation in an unromantic place. She gave him the summary without editorializing. He listened without interrupting, which was what he did when the information was dense enough to require full processing before response. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Back to the beginning of the review cycle, he said. Yes. That's months. Yes. He looked at the vehicle beside him, put his hand on the cold hood briefly, then took it back. And Harkin Valley. Separate review, no timeline. He exhaled, not dramatically, just the kind of breath that moves through a person when they've been holding something and release it without meaning to. You're not going to break, he said. It wasn't a question or a reassurance, just an observation, the way he made most observations, direct, without ornament. I'm not planning on it, she said. I know you're not planning on it. He looked at her. I'm saying it because it's true, not to make you feel better. She understood the distinction. It mattered, coming from him. The deputy director, she said, Calloway's superior. If Faust's review produces findings, it will affect the Harkin Valley notation. Mason nodded. Potentially. Potentially. Records corrections aren't fast. Nothing about this is fast, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then, Stoll is gone from the assessment. Yes. The pattern notation is struck. Yes. That's not nothing, he said. It was almost exactly what she'd said to him in the corridor 2 hours ago, which she thought might be intentional and which she appreciated without saying so. No, she said. It's not nothing. The conversation with Calloway happened the following morning, and she hadn't planned it, and he apparently hadn't either, because it occurred at the coffee station in the common area at 06:15 when she'd assumed the room would be empty, and he'd come in from a direction she hadn't expected. They both stopped. The coffee station between them. He looked like he'd slept poorly, which she noticed without drawing conclusions from. She poured her coffee. He waited, which was either courtesy or the recognition that moving toward the station would bring him within a meter of her, and he wasn't certain about that distance. She turned around, and he was still standing there. The supplementary note, she said. You filed it before Faust's office called. Yes, he said. Why? He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be genuine rather than performed. Because I watched you hold that position for 6 seconds in 14-knot crosswind and make the shot, he said. And I've been in evaluation work for 3 years and I've never seen it. And putting something false in a record because of a process someone else designed is... He stopped. Started again. I have a lot of things I'd do differently. About Harkin Valley. I couldn't fix those yesterday. I could fix what was in front of me. She looked at him. The testimony you gave at the board, she said. You didn't contradict me. No. But you didn't corroborate either. No. He held her eyes. I was a first lieutenant and my section chief had strong opinions about the cross-sector engagement, and I made a choice about how much I was willing to fight for. He paused. It was the wrong choice. I've known that for 4 years. The common room was quiet around them. Outside, the base was beginning its morning cycle. Engines, voices, the rhythmic ordinary noise of a forward operating base coming awake. I can't give you back 4 years, he said. No, she said. You can't. A beat. The evaluation rubric issue, she said. The post-acquisition classification. If the standards committee reviews it, I'll give them an honest account of the methodology I used, he said, including why it was problematic. He paused. That's going to be an uncomfortable conversation for me to have. Yes, she said. It is. She picked up her coffee. She almost walked away. Instead, she stopped and turned back because 4 years was a long time to carry something, and she was tired of carrying things that didn't need to be carried. For what it's worth, she said, I don't think you're a bad officer. He looked at her. I think you made a bad call under pressure, and you've been living with it, she said. That's human. It doesn't make the 4 years okay, but it's not the same as being rotten. He didn't say anything. His expression did something she didn't examine too carefully. She walked out of the common room into the cold morning. The review that Faust's office conducted over the following 3 weeks moved with the specific efficiency of an investigation that has genuine authority behind it and a clear evidentiary trail to follow. The deputy director's involvement in the Harkin Valley Board was documented through meeting minutes, internal correspondence, and the testimony of the primary board member, now retired, who confirmed that the dissent had been initiated at the deputy director's suggestion, rather than arising independently from the dissenting member's assessment. The dissenting member, confronted with the documentation, acknowledged the characterization was accurate. The finding was not criminal. It was procedural misconduct, an improper influence over a board of inquiry process, and its consequences were administrative rather than prosecutorial. The deputy director received a formal reprimand and was removed from his current position pending a reassignment review. The Harkin Valley notation in Lena's file was not automatically cleared by the finding. That required a separate formal process, which Faust's office initiated simultaneously. The notation would stand pending review, which meant it was still technically in the file, but its status had shifted from a passive negative into an active disputed item, which was different in ways that anyone who read files professionally would immediately understand. She found out most of this from Briggs, who found out from his network of people who worked adjacent to the machinery of institutional decision-making and understood its sounds the way mechanics understand engine noise. "The deputy director is done," Briggs said. He said it without satisfaction, just information. Assignment review is usually a polite way of saying the next assignment doesn't come. "And Stoll?" she asked. "Back in a different division after the conflict review closes. Not assessment." He paused. He wasn't dirty, exactly. He used a legitimate framework in a way that wasn't neutral. Hard to prosecute that. "I know," she said. "I'm not looking to prosecute it." Briggs looked at her. "What are you looking for?" She thought about that honestly. "A file that says what actually happened," she said, "at Harkin Valley and at Blackthorn. That's all." "That might be what you get," Briggs said. "Eventually." "Eventually," she agreed. Faust's last morning at FOB Kessler, she walked the northern perimeter before her flight, which was either a personal habit or something she did in unfamiliar places to understand their shape. Lena saw her from the range access road and didn't approach, and Faust didn't signal for company, and they both understood the distance as appropriate. But on the flight line before Faust boarded, she stopped beside Lena, who was standing with Mason at a distance that was close enough to be present, but far enough to be respectful of the departure process. "The commendation review will restart," Faust said. "New assessment team. Clean file. Stoll's notation struck." She paused. "It won't be fast." "I understand," Lena said. "The Harkin Valley review, the notation status, will take longer. I won't lie to you about that timeline. I appreciate that you don't." Faust looked at her for a moment with the direct attention she'd brought to everything in their interactions. Not performing appraisal, just actually looking. "You've been carrying that file for 4 years," she said. "And you haven't stopped working. That's in the record too, whether the notation says so or not." Lena didn't answer that. There wasn't a good answer that wasn't either too small or too large. Faust nodded once, to her, then to Mason, and walked up the ramp. Mason stood beside Lena while the flight crew ran through departure prep. 4 months to the next review cycle, he said, give or take. Ruck wants to know if you're running this afternoon. Ruck wants to know everything. Ruck is bored, Mason said. His ribs are still taped and he can't do anything useful, and he's driving everyone insane. She almost smiled. Tell him yes, she said. Slow pace. I'm not running his ribs into a problem. The aircraft engine spun up. The sound built across the flight line and pushed the conversation out of the space between them, and they stood in the noise and watched the aircraft begin to move and didn't try to talk over it. When the aircraft lifted and the noise dropped to a manageable level, Mason said something she almost missed. For what it's worth, by Calloway's note in the record, the 310-meter shot. He looked at the sky where the aircraft was still visible, diminishing. That's going to be in the file permanently, even after everything else resolves. She looked at him. One shot, she said. In an evaluation, one shot that nobody else has made in 3 years of exercises, he said, at a position that held 90 fighters for 42 minutes. He turned to look at her. The record doesn't always say what actually happened, but this time it does. And that's not nothing. She looked back at the sky. The aircraft had disappeared into the ridgeline's shadow, and the flight line was settling back into its ordinary sounds, and somewhere across the base, Ruck was sitting with taped ribs and too much energy and waiting for someone to tell him the afternoon's plan. No, she said quietly, it's not nothing. She turned away from the flight line and walked back toward the base, and the mountains around FOB Kessler held their silence the way they always did, patient, indifferent, and permanent in a way that made 4 years feel both very long and very short, depending on which direction you were looking. The 4 months passed the way waiting always passes when the thing being waited for is real. Not slowly exactly, but with a specific texture, each day distinct enough to remember and collectively compressed in retrospect into something that felt shorter than it had been while living through it. Lena ran every morning. She qualified on the range every week. She completed 2 additional reconnaissance attachments in the eastern sector that generated clean after-action reports with no anomalies and no notation flags, which was both the point and the entire point. The record building itself one entry at a time, each clean mission another brick in the wall of evidence that said, this is who she is, consistently across time. Ruck's ribs healed. Torres's arm stopped favoring itself around week 6. Vega's knee required a surgical consult that he delayed twice and then attended under direct orders from Mason, who had a limited supply of patience for operators who treated their own bodies as optional maintenance items. Briggs continued monitoring the institutional machinery with the dedication of someone who had found his calling and knew it, forwarding updates to Lena with the regularity of a news service and the editorial restraint of someone who understood that information without interpretation was more useful than information with spin attached. The deputy director's reassignment was finalized in month 2, a lateral administrative position with no oversight authority, no direct reports, and no involvement in review processes of any kind. Briggs included the posting without comment. Lena read it once and filed it, and didn't think about it again for a long time, because the energy required to feel things about it wasn't energy she had available for anything useful. Stoll resurfaced in a logistics assessment role at a different regional command. Briggs noted this with slightly more commentary than usual. 3 words, out of play. And Lena agreed with the assessment and moved on. Calloway submitted his formal account to the Rubric Standards Committee in month 1. She didn't read it until month 3, when Briggs obtained a copy through channels he declined to specify. The account was thorough and technically precise and did not spare his own methodology from criticism. He described the post-acquisition classification approach in terms that made its structural flaw clear without making himself the villain of the analysis, which was the honest version rather than the flattering one, and she respected the distinction. The Standards Committee issued a revised rubric guidance in month 3 that specified pre-designation as the required classification timing for dynamic evaluation scenarios. The revision cited the evaluation in question without naming the parties involved, which was standard procedure. She put the revised rubric in her file without ceremony. The review board convened on a Wednesday in the 4th month. She wasn't there. That wasn't how commendation review boards worked. The subject wasn't present. The record spoke without a spokesperson. The board read and discussed and voted and produced a finding that was then communicated through channels to the relevant commands. It was deliberately impersonal, which she understood was designed to protect the process from advocacy, and which she had found, across her career, to be both appropriate and deeply frustrating in approximately equal measure. Mason was in the operations room when the communication came through. He read it twice, set it down on the console, and walked across the compound to the range where Lena was running a drill sequence with Ruck, who was cleared for full physical activity again, and was making up for the weeks of inactivity with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been kept inside too long. Mason stood at the range's edge and waited. She finished the sequence, lowered the rifle, looked at him across the distance. His face was doing something. She walked toward him, and the closer she got, the more clearly she could read the something his face was doing, and by the time she was within 10 meters, she understood that the review board had produced a finding, and the finding was not ambiguous. She stopped in front of him. "Tell me," she said. "The commendation elevation was approved," he said. "Unanimous." She heard the words. "Let them arrive." "The Harkin Valley review found in your favor," he continued. "The notation is being struck from the file. Full finding. The documentation deficiency was determined to be a procedural irregularity in the board process itself, not a reflection of your engagement decision." She looked at him. "Both," she said. "Both," he confirmed. The range was quiet around them. Ruck, who had been watching from the firing line with the stillness of someone trying to give a moment its space, said nothing. The wind moved through the range markers. The mountains beyond the base perimeter were sharp and indifferent against the midday sky. She turned away from Mason for a moment and looked at those mountains. She thought about the Board of Inquiry 4 years ago, the fluorescent conference room, the formal language of findings and notations, the specific helplessness of watching a record being written in ways you couldn't correct in real time. She thought about the weight of the flagged file and the years of running faster and qualifying cleaner and building the record one entry at a time, because the record was the only argument she had access to, and she'd refused to stop making it. She thought about the northern slope at Harkin Valley, and the crew-served weapon that would have ended the ground element's assault, and the decision she'd made in approximately 4 seconds that had been argued about in meeting rooms for 4 years. She turned back to Mason. "The finding," she said, "on Harkin Valley, the documentation deficiency, it was determined to be procedural irregularity in the board itself." "Yes," he said, "the deputy director's involvement is cited in the finding. The influence on the dissent created a flawed review process. The insufficiency notation was a product of that flawed process, not of your actual documentation." "So the record will reflect what actually happened," Mason said, "at Harkin Valley and at Blackthorn." She was quiet for a moment that was longer than she'd expected it to be. Not from uncertainty, from the particular requirement of receiving something you've worked toward long enough that you've had to learn to function without expecting it to arrive. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "That's it? What do you want me to say?" "I don't know, something." She thought about it. "I need coffee," she said. "Then I'll have something." Ruck, from the firing line, said, "I'll get the coffee." He was already moving before either of them responded, which was Ruck's particular way of demonstrating care. Through motion, through immediate practical action, through never making anyone articulate a need that he could simply meet. The formal notification came through Drayden's office that afternoon in the language of official communications, measured, passive-voiced, procedurally precise. And Drayden called her in and read her the relevant sections, and then set the document down and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been waiting to have a particular conversation for several months, and is now deciding how to have it. "The commendation ceremony is typically handled at the unit level for this decoration tier," he said. "With a command-level witness, I'd like to schedule it within the next 2 weeks." "All right," she said. "Is there anyone you'd like present beyond the unit?" She thought about that. "No," she said. "The unit is enough." He nodded. "I'll coordinate with Mason on timing." He picked up the document again, and she understood the meeting was moving toward its conclusion, and then he said something that wasn't on any official agenda. "When I wrote the commendation recommendation," he said, "I knew there would be pushback. The metrics were unusual, and the institutional tendency with unusual metrics is to question rather than credit." He was looking at the document, not at her. "I wrote it anyway because the Blackthorn record was unambiguous to anyone who was actually present." She waited. "I want you to know that I never doubted the accuracy of what went into that file," he said, "whatever the review process did with it in the interim." She understood he was telling her something that colonels didn't typically say out loud, and that the telling of it cost him something in the particular economy of command authority. "Thank you," she said. "That matters." He looked up and nodded once, and the meeting concluded, and she walked back out into the afternoon. She found a quiet corner of the communications block and sat down and called a number she didn't call often. It rang 4 times before picking up, and the voice on the other end was familiar in the deep, specific way of voices that have been present through formative things. Her mother. "Lena." The warmth in the single word was not performed. It never had been. "Hey," Lena said, "you sound tired." "I'm fine." "You always say that." "It's usually true." A pause on the line. The comfortable kind. "Something happened," her mother said. Not a question. "Something got resolved," Lena said. "It took a while." "The thing from 4 years ago?" Her mother had known about Harkin Valley in the way that parents know things, not the operational details, not the specific language of board findings and notation flags, but the shape of it, the weight. The way it had changed the texture of phone calls in the period immediately after, before Lena had figured out how to carry it without it showing. "That and something more recent," Lena said. "Both got resolved." The line was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" her mother asked. Lena leaned her head back against the wall behind her. The communications block was empty at this hour, and the building held the particular quiet of a space designed for noise that was momentarily without it. "Yes?" she said. And then, because her mother would hear the difference, "I actually am, not just saying it." "Good," her mother said, simply, without ceremony. Just good. The word carrying the weight of 4 years of not saying anything more complicated than that, when complicated wasn't what was needed. They talked for 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with commendations or review boards, her mother's garden, a neighbor's new dog, the particular injustice of a recipe that had worked perfectly twice and then failed the third time for no identifiable reason. Ordinary things in the ordinary language of a relationship that had learned to hold the hard stuff without making it the only stuff. When she hung up, she sat for another few minutes in the quiet room. Then she went back to work. The ceremony happened on a Friday, which was practical rather than symbolic. Fridays were when the unit's operational tempo allowed for non-mission activities, and nobody had suggested a different day because the day wasn't the point. The ceremony itself was brief and without theater. The compound's briefing room, which was also used for pre-op planning and equipment inventories and the occasional heated argument about radio protocol, had been cleared of the usual detritus. 8 people in the room: Drayden, Mason, Torres, Vega, Ruck, Briggs, Lena, and a command witness whose name she wouldn't remember a week later because the command witness was procedurally required and humanly irrelevant. Drayden read the commendation language. It was formal and passive and captured approximately 40% of what had actually happened at Blackthorn, which was roughly the percentage that official language ever managed, and she accepted this as the nature of official language rather than a failure of it. He pinned the decoration. She stood for it the way she stood for most things, straight, still, without performance. When Drayden stepped back, the room didn't break into applause because that wasn't the unit's register for significant moments. What happened instead was that Torres said, "About time," in a tone that was dry enough to be funny and sincere enough to be something more than that. Ruck made a sound of agreement that contained 3 months of taped ribs and early morning runs, and the particular solidarity of people who had been in the same tower and the same stone walls and understood from first-hand evidence what the decoration represented. Briggs said nothing. He was looking at his hands, which he did when he was managing something he didn't want to perform. Vega, whose knee had been surgically addressed in month 3 and who was walking without a limp for the first time since Blackthorn, raised his coffee cup. Mason raised his, she raised hers. They drank. It was terrible coffee, which was standard for every coffee produced at FOB Kessler and which nobody had ever successfully addressed despite numerous attempts. "We could do something more than coffee," Ruck said. "I'm just saying." "We're operational tomorrow," Mason said. "We're always operational tomorrow." "That's the job." "I'm not complaining about the job," Ruck looked at Lena. "I'm saying the occasion warrants something that doesn't taste like it was filtered through a boot." "The coffee is fine," she said. "The coffee is objectively terrible." "I know," she said, "but it's what we have, and it's enough." Ruck looked at her for a moment, and then looked at his cup and seemed to accept this as a philosophical position rather than just a comment on the beverage. 3 days after the ceremony, she received a message from Calloway. Not a call, a written message, which was consistent with the care he'd been taking in their interactions since the evaluation. Written things could be revised before sending. They gave both parties time. The message was short. The Standards Committee issued the revised rubric guidance last month. "I expect you've seen it. I wanted to say that I hope it helps people who come after you, even though it doesn't give back what the methodology cost you. I also wanted to say that the account I gave the committee was the honest one. I thought you should know that from me directly rather than from a document. I'm being reassigned next month. Different command. I don't know if our paths cross again professionally. I hope, if they do, it's on better terms than they started." She read it twice. She thought about 4 years, about the boardroom and the flagged file, and the mornings when the record's weight was most present, and she'd run anyway because running was the only argument she had. She thought about a man in his mid-career making a choice under pressure and living with it long enough to understand it differently. She wrote back, "I saw the revised rubric. It's a better standard. That matters more than anything between us. Good luck at the new command." She sent it before she could revise it into something more or less than what it was. The Harkin Valley notation was formally struck from her file on a Tuesday in the 5th month. She received the notification through the standard records update channel, a routine administrative message, the language identical to any other file update, which was either the system's limitation or its design, and either way it arrived in her inbox between a maintenance schedule update and a range qualification reminder. She read it, closed the message. opened the range qualification reminder, and confirmed her slot for Thursday. Briggs appeared at her workstation approximately 4 minutes later, which meant he'd been monitoring the records update channel and had seen the notification at roughly the same time she had. "That's it?" he said. "It's done." "Yes," she said. 4 years. "I know how long it was." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't seem—" He stopped. "What?" "I don't know. Different." She looked at him. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," he said again. "Something." She thought about how to explain that the moment of an institutional finding and the moment of actually feeling something are almost never the same moment, and that the feeling had arrived in pieces across the last several months. When Faust walked off the aircraft, when Mason said both, when her mother said good in the way that carried 4 years, and that the notation being struck was the formal completion of something that had already completed in the ways that mattered. She didn't explain any of that. "Get me coffee," she said instead. "Not the compound stuff, the decent bag Torres' sister sent." Briggs looked at her. Then he almost smiled. Not quite, but close. "That's reserved for special occasions," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He went to get it. Got. The mission brief for the Eastern Sector attachment came through that same afternoon. 5 days, a reconnaissance objective at a mountain position she'd worked twice before, familiar terrain with a new intelligence requirement. She reviewed the brief with Mason in the operations room and asked 3 questions and received 3 answers, and felt the particular forward pull of an approaching mission that was one of the things she genuinely trusted about herself. That the work always felt like the next thing, never like an escape from the last one. "You're good for this?" Mason asked. Standard question. He asked it before every mission, regardless of context. "Yes," she said. Standard answer. She meant it, regardless of context. He nodded. "Insertions at 0200 Saturday. Full team." "Ruck's ribs?" "Cleared 2 weeks ago. He's been cleared longer than he's been telling you, incidentally." She looked at Mason. "He didn't want you adjusting his pace during the morning runs," Mason said. "I'm told he found it, his word, demoralizing." She thought about Ruck running every morning at a pace she'd consciously held below her own because she'd been protecting ribs she hadn't known were already healed. "He's an idiot," she said. "He's loyal," Mason said. "Those frequently overlap." The night before the insertion, she sat on the exterior steps of the barracks block and looked at the mountains. The sky was clear in the specific way of high-altitude nights. Black between the stars, no gradations, just the sharp contrast of light against nothing. She'd been looking at these mountains for 6 months now, and they had not changed, which was both obvious and the thing she found consistently useful about them. They didn't adjust to reflect anything happening below them. They held whatever shape the geology had given them, and indifferent to the human machinery at their feet. Torres came out and sat 1 step below her without asking if she wanted company, which was consistent with his operating approach across their entire working relationship. They sat for a while without talking. "The Eastern Sector assignment," he said eventually. "You've done that terrain twice." "3 times, she said. "The first one doesn't show in my primary file because it was a joint attachment. Different units after action." "Right," he paused. "Good terrain." "Good terrain," she agreed. Another silence. "The notation," Torres said. "Harkin Valley. It's gone." "Yes." "How does that feel?" She thought about Briggs asking essentially the same question and giving essentially the same answer, the one about feeling things in pieces over time rather than in one official moment. She thought about whether that answer was complete or whether it was just the version she'd had available that morning. "Like something I've been carrying got lighter," she said. "Not gone, because it happened and it's part of what I know, but lighter." Torres nodded. He was good at nodding in ways that meant he understood the distinction being made. 4 years is a long time to carry something heavy, he said. "People carry longer," she said, "for worse reasons." "True," he said. "Doesn't make yours shorter." She looked at the stars. The mountain silhouettes were dark against them, sharp-edged, the kind of clean line you only got at elevation, where the air had nothing in it to blur the border between rock and sky. "I thought about separating," she said, "about 2 years in, when the Harkin Valley thing wasn't resolving and the file was what it was, and I was—" She paused. Running on fumes, probably. Professionally. Torres didn't react with surprise, which meant either it hadn't surprised him or he was good at managing his reactions. Both were possible with Torres. "What stopped you?" he asked. She thought about that honestly. "The work," she said. "Not the institution, the actual work. Being in positions, reading terrain, doing the one specific thing I'm good at in the places where it matters." She paused. "I couldn't find a version of not doing it that made sense as a life." "And now?" "Now the file says what actually happened," she said. "Both files. And tomorrow we're going back into the mountains." She looked at him. "That's enough. It's actually enough." He was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "when I tell people what happened at Blackthorn, not often, but when it comes up, nobody believes the number." "Which number?" 47, he said. 90 attackers, 6 defenders, 42 minutes. Nobody believes the 47. "I know," she said. "What do you tell them when they don't believe it?" She thought about it. "I tell them that what they're imagining is the wrong version," she said. "They're imagining something spectacular, something dramatic. But it wasn't. It was just one target, one breath, one trigger pull, repeated, for 42 minutes. She paused. Anyone who's done the work long enough to do it right knows it's mostly just that. The repetition of small correct things over and over until the situation changes. Torres looked at her. "That's a good answer," he said. "It's the true one," she said. "Good and true aren't always the same thing." "They are in that case." She almost smiled. They sat there until the temperature dropped enough to make the steps genuinely uncomfortable, and then Torres said something about needing to check his kit before morning, which was true, and also the polite version of recognizing that some moments have a natural ending point that doesn't require formal closure, and he went inside. She stayed another few minutes. The mountains didn't move. The stars didn't shift. The base was quiet beneath the particular rhythm of its own nighttime cycle. Distant voices. A vehicle engine somewhere. The routine pulse of a forward operating base that didn't stop existing after dark. She thought about Blackthorn, about the tower, and the cold stone, and the way the valley had looked with fires burning in it from 300 meters in the air through an open helicopter door. She thought about the boardroom at Harkin Valley 4 years ago and the specific quality of helplessness in that room, the kind that comes from accuracy being insufficient, from being right about what happened and unable to make the record agree. She thought about the record as it now stood. Blackthorn documented clearly, Harkin Valley's notation struck, the commendation in the file alongside the evaluation scores, and Callaway's supplementary note about a 310-meter moving target shot on a 6-second clock. The record said what actually happened. That was not nothing. After 4 years, it was something she'd stopped being certain would ever be true. And the fact that it was true now didn't erase the 4 years, but it changed their meaning, transformed them from a wound into a context, from something that had happened to her into something she had outlasted. She stood up from the steps. She was cold, and the insertion was at 0200, and she had a mission brief to review one more time before she could sleep, and the mountains would be exactly where they were in the morning, unchanged, ready to be worked. She went inside. The Eastern Sector mission ran 5 days and completed clean. The intelligence objective was recovered intact. The team moved through familiar terrain with the practiced efficiency of people who had been in the mountains long enough to understand them as a working environment rather than an obstacle. No contact, no casualties, no notation flags. The after-action went into the file on a Thursday morning, 1 week after the Harkin Valley notation had been struck, and it sat in the record alongside everything else that had accumulated across 6 years. The clean missions, the difficult ones, the flagged file that was no longer flagged, the commendation that had finally arrived at its correct destination. She read the after-action once to confirm accuracy. Then she closed the file. Briggs was on the radio across the room, working through a frequency calibration that had been giving him problems for 2 days. Ruck was doing something loud and apparently strenuous in the equipment bay. Torres was at the range. Vega was at the medical unit getting a follow-up on his knee. Mason was in the operations room working through the next mission brief, which was already on his desk because the mission cycle didn't pause for commendations or file corrections or any of the institutional drama that had occupied the last 6 months. She picked up her coffee. Decent stuff. Torres's sister's bag, which had been rationed carefully enough to last 3 weeks. and walked to the operations room doorway. Mason looked up. "Next brief's ready," he said. "I know," she said. "I saw it come through." "Northern sector. Different terrain from the eastern. I've worked it once, 2 years ago." "I remember," he said. "Your call on the approach vector was better than mine." She looked at him. "You never said that at the time," she said. "You didn't need me to say it at the time," he said. "You needed me to acknowledge it in a mission debrief 2 years later. That's not how debriefs work." "No," he said. "It isn't." He set down the brief. "You want to look at it now?" She stepped into the room and sat in the chair across from his desk, the chair that had held Drayden during the commendation debrief, the chair that had held any number of conversations about things that mattered and things that didn't, and picked up the mission brief and started reading. Outside, the mountains were doing what mountains do, holding their shape against a sky that moved around them without moving them, carrying snow at the peaks that wouldn't melt until summer, and possibly not even then. They were the same mountains that had been there during Blackthorn, during Harkin Valley, during every mission in the 6 years that constituted her file. They would be there for the next mission and the one after that. That was the work. Not the commendations or the review boards or the institutional machinery that processed merit through committees and timelines and notation flags. Not the recognition, which mattered, but which arrived last and carried the least weight of everything that had built toward it. The work was what she went back to, what she'd always gone back to. One target, one breath, one trigger pull, repeated for as long as the situation required, and then the next situation, and the one after that. She read the mission brief. She asked Mason 2 questions and received 2 answers, and identified the approach vector she would have chosen and confirmed it matched his before saying anything about it, because being right mattered less than being accurate, and accuracy was what the mission required. "Saturday insertion," he said. "I'll be ready," she said. She would be. Quote, 4 weeks later, a signals intelligence report was forwarded to FOB Kessler from the Blackthorn sector, a routine intercept, part of the ongoing monitoring of militia communications in the Northern Highlands. A fragment caught the analyst's attention, dated several weeks after the Blackthorn assault, recovered from a secondary archive that had only recently been decrypted. A single transmission between 2 surviving fighters from the assault, discussing the night in the shorthand of people who had been there. The analyst flagged it and sent it up the chain. It landed eventually in Drayden's office, where it was forwarded to Mason, who read it and walked it down the hall and set it on Lena's workstation without comment. She read it. The fragment in translation said, "They ask me how many were up there. I tell them I don't know. It could have been 1. It could have been 30. You couldn't tell. Wherever you moved, there it was." She read it twice. Then she folded it, put it in her pocket, and went back to the range qualification she'd been in the middle of when Mason had walked in. She didn't show it to anyone. She didn't need to. It was just information, accurate information as it happened, and the record already had what it needed. She raised the rifle. Wind from the northwest, consistent 11 knots. Range 400 meters. Moving target right to left. She breathed out. She fired. The target registered clean. She cycled the bolt and found the next one. The record doesn't always say what actually happened, but the people who were there know. And sometimes, if you keep doing the work long enough, the record catches up. It doesn't always, but sometimes it does. That's enough to keep going.